How about what the Civil War was really all about? Yeah, that Supreme Court justice that put John Fry's on the gallows was named Samuel Chase. And he was the one they tried to impeach. And he was the one that our current Chief Justice wrote an article about and said that was a wonderful thing that he didn't impeach him. And I wrote and said it's a terrible shame they didn't impeach him because it established a pattern of perpetuating incompetent and bad judges. And we should have a way of getting rid of them. And if you can't get rid of this guy, then you'll never get rid of any of them, you know. But they do now once in a while. If they get them on tax evasion, they usually can throw them out. They do that. But
speaking of judges,
yeah.
What would it take to have a mechanism to limit or have a recall provision for federal judges that now have a lifetime appointment?
Well, that's Constitution says that they are for life, or, you're stuck with them. Yeah.
It says that, as I recall, in the Constitution it says something along the lines of, as long as they...
Good behavior, then the same. Yeah, that's true. But that's a slippery word, good behavior. Yeah, we are kind of stuck with them. I know that. It's really too bad because I've talked to some lawyers that have practiced a lot in the federal courts, and they got some of these old senile guys that are just awful, and they just have a terrible time. They're sleeping up there on it's a judge trial, not even a jury, and he's sound asleep up there because he's long beyond his competency, and you're stuck with him. I think you'd have to amend the Constitution myself.
Or short of that, I guess, on specific, the only way you couldn't go at it generally, but I understand on a specific cause, the Congress has the power to limit judicial review on a certain...
Okay.
That would be the only way to keep their hands out of them.
Well, they probably could figure out something, but I don't think they will. The Constitution is a pretty. It's sort of like a piece of Swiss cheese. You got all kind of holes. You can find your way through them. It's
a relationship to Salmon Chase.
Maybe it is Salmon. Maybe it is Salmon.
No.
Salmon was that was a Civil War guy, and he was in the cabinet. That's right. Yeah.
I wonder if this is a relation to the Chase.
I don't know. I wouldn't know. Yeah, but the other guy.
They would both be high judge.
Yeah. Well, Salmon Chase is interesting because he became Chief Justice,
right.
And he really longed to write an opinion to go against the South that you couldn't secede. So he finally got his chance after the Civil War in the case on was it the Texas bonds or something? I think there were some bonds that Texas had issued, and then the argument was made that the bonds weren't any good because, the bonds were good because whatever it was, you can't secede, but you could secede, and it all boiled down to a question of whether or not this was in, and therefore these bonds, I guess that was it, and they had seceded, but if the secession ordinance was void and was illegal, then Texas was still in the Union, and then the bonds were good. I think that was the argument. And he got a great opportunity to argue the case that the secession was no illegal and no states had the right to secede. Nobody took it too serious, though, I don't think. But that was his crowning glory, was to basically give a judicial approval of the Civil War, because that's the reason why they didn't prosecute for treason Jefferson Davis, because they were afraid they'd lose. And first they thought they'd win, and everybody was excited about it, and they had it, well, it can be the trial of the century, and this was really going to be something. And then they got around to it, hiring some pretty good lawyers. One of them was Richard Taney, and they said, we're going to lose this. And you're going to get a judicial opinion that's justified. And if it can't be treason, and we're going to lose this. So, but you better find a way out of it. And it's funny because the government first started off gung-ho. They were going to really nail this guy, and then the more they got into it, and the more good lawyers got a voice in it, they said, you got to find some way out of this because we're going to lose it if we go to court. And of course, Jefferson Davis, he wouldn't ask for a pardon. He wanted to be tried and vindicated and let it go. And it was amazing that they finally chickened out, because, and then of course they had this wonderful opinion by Salmon Chase, But that's an interesting period of our history, isn't it? I wanted to talk a little bit, go back to the constitutional problem. I think one of the most interesting expressions on the Constitution was by Madison. Now, many people look upon Madison as the father of the Constitution. He was certainly a big gun behind it, and he pushed it. And he wrote in the Federalist number 10, and he talked about taxes, and it's amazing that the world got away from what he had to say. Let's see if I got him right here. Yeah, he said, yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. He's talking about taxes. Every share your number is a shilling saved in their own pockets. So this is the old story about the dominant party being able to put taxes on a minority party. He then said, and this is really good, it is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust all these conflicting interests and render them subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Boy, that says it all. And so the argument was, well, sure, you can have this potential injustice, and you're sure you can have a predominant party that's going to overtax the minority party, but we have wise leaders who will never let that happen. And yet, when you get down to the Supreme Court case on the Constitution, that's essentially, this is the case that was in 1960, and that's essentially what they said. They said, well, the argument that this will become out of balance and unjust and you'll overburden. This was on the question of progressive rates. They said, well, this won't happen because if it did happen, then that would mean that the Democratic and Republican government is at an end. That never satisfied me. What do you mean it's at an end? They do it all the time. Perhaps the best Civil War bit of tax information came from the House when they were debating some new taxes that you pay for the war, and one of the representatives said, well, the tax was like a man that had a boil on the end of his nose, and he kept complaining about the boil on his nose. And finally one of his buddies said, well, where else would you rather have it? And he said, on some other guy's back. and that's kind of the story of tax making from the beginning of time. Put it on some other guy's back. But then Madison then was followed up by Hamilton. And so here you have the problem. You have a constitution in which a majority can overburden a minority and abuse them. And then Madison says that we've got to do something about it in so many words. And the interesting answer to that was Hamilton about the danger of partiality and oppression in taxes in the Constitution. And Hamilton said, but it is prevented because we have a uniformity clause. And the uniformity clause, in effect, says that you can't burden one group and not another group. It has to be everybody treated the same. Well, Hamilton, a pretty bright guy. Surprised he was so dumb. But anyway, so much then for the uniformity clause. When we get to a Civil War period, we've had this what I call the War of the Tariffs. And we start with an earlier one, but the real war was the Tariff of Abomination in 1828, and that particular tariff was the one that prompted South Carolina to say they were going to get out of the Union. What they would do, really, they just annulled the tariff on the grounds that Congress couldn't adopt a tariff like that, and we have the power of nullification. Now, who can tell me about the power of nullification and whatever became of it? Any of you know what I'm talking about?
Jackson.
Yeah, what Jackson? Pardon?
Jackson said that he was going to collect the tax.
That's right. Yeah, he almost started a war. But what about nullification? What was South Carolina talking about? Yeah.
Perhaps I've heard concerning juries. If the law is unfair, they can vote whether the law is valid or not itself, as well as whether the facts in the case.
Well, nullification was very popular during the early days, and Jefferson mentioned it, and some of the other framers of the Constitution mentioned it. What do you do when the federal government, the Congress, exceeds its powers?
Well,
in your state? That's right. Yeah.
Threw it out there.
Yeah.
When South Carolina tried it, Jackson refused to accept it, and that more or less ended it.
Well, they got together and didn't want to start a civil war, and it was Clay, I think, and Calhoun, and they agreed to start reducing the tariff. So in a sense, South Carolina was winning, but they didn't win nullification. But nullification was a pretty strong argument during that period. You know, if the government did something that violated the Constitution, a state had the right to nullify the law. And so South Carolina, in effect, nullified the tariff because they felt that it was not within the powers of the Constitution to make this kind of a tariff, because a tariff was for revenue, and this one wasn't for revenue. This was basically a harmful tariff to the South, and so they would vote it out. So anyway, that was the nullification doctrine. It stayed on it for a long time, and then after the episode with Jackson, the South shifted from nullification to secession. The best idea is to say, we'll just get out. You know, we'll just go our own way. And so we have the right to get out if we want to. And they threatened it off and on all through this period. And I think it was generally conceded that they probably could secede. When the secession ordinances were adopted by the South in 1860 and 61, a number of the northern newspapers recognized the right of secession. That, you know, the Constitution that talks about the consent of the governed, and if the southern states don't want to be in the Confederation, they have a right to get out. They had the same right to get in. It was their argument, and we voted to go in. Now we can vote to get out, and that would seem to be pretty true with leagues in Europe. It seemed to have a long, respectable history. The problem was that we got in this awful war over it. And the sequence is interesting, because in my book I maintained, the South maintained that they were really going to secede because of the taxes that were unfair, because the Constitution said taxes had to be uniform, and they were not uniform, that the South paid the vast majority of the taxes, and the North didn't pay anything. And worse than that, as Calhoun said, not only did we pay all the taxes, then after we paid them, all of the money was spent on the North. So we were really getting it, you know, from both ends. And that was Calhoun's argument. And that was Calhoun. That argument shows up in the Charleston Mercury, I guess it was. And it was throughout the South at the time the Civil War got started. So there was a strong feeling that they were getting had. The war, as you know how it went, the Southerners seized a number of the forts in the South, and they were lined up to seize Fort Sumter. And of course, in the meantime, you have this President Buchanan, and you had this long period from the election in November to the swearing in of Lincoln in March. And so during this period, there was when the southern states were seceding, is when this period they were seizing some of the forts. And then the question boiled down to Fort Sumter. And one of the interesting things is that the general of the army, he said, it was Scott, he said, well, it would take 20,000 men to protect that fort, and we really don't need it. It has no military value. And so I have a chapter in my book called A Useless Fort, ? And I think if you look into some of the writings of this period, the forts were there to collect the revenue on the coming into the country. They enforced the tariff, basically. And so it wasn't a useless fort. And that was the main purpose of the forts, and the writers say that it was to collect and protect the revenue. Well, on the Sumter problem, there was so much effort on Lincoln to let it go. Don't start a war over the fort. We don't need it anyway. And so that's where the arguments went. But then Lincoln got the idea, and he went to his cabinet, and what do you think? Well, the first time they said let it go, and then finally it came out that of all the terrible consequences that could happen to the North if the South seceded. First, the New York Times, for example, said, oh, it's no big deal, we can get along without them. Then, after they got thinking about it, the New York Times came around and says, hey, we got to stop these guys, because they're going to ruin the country. The wharves and the docks will be empty, our factories will shut down. They pay this horrible story, what would happen if the South seceded. And that is when the momentum came up to stop these guys before we get ruined. In order to protect ourselves, we're going to have custom houses from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way to New Mexico, because the goods can come in so much cheaper in the South. And then the rumor came out that the South had made a deal with Britain, and they were going to have a free trade zone. And boy, then the people in Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh steel interests, they were up in arms. So the economics of secession would have been disastrous to the North, or so the North thought. And I think that's one of the reasons why Lincoln finally, when he was approached by a fellow named Baldwin and from Virginia, who came up because Virginia was debating whether or not they secede, and Lincoln's famous question was, well, what will become of my tariff, and what will I do for my revenue? So we have all this setting that the whole economics of what behind the Civil War, and I think economics, seems to me a pretty good obvious thing, that money makes the world go round. And yet today we keep hearing the story, and we keep told, and we keep teaching our kids. Like one of the boys I was talking to said he went to private school, and they told him the Civil War was economics, and then when he went to public school, they told him, remember, you told me this, the Civil War was over slavery when he went to public school. It's an interesting switch from public school to private school with your teacher's different point of view, but. Maybe the problem we have is that, as I've said sometimes, maybe we shouldn't write our own history. Maybe humanity aren't capable of being honest and fair about themselves. Maybe we just don't like the right history the right way it is. I started my book off on the Civil War with a quotation from an ancient historian, Polybius, and Polybius was considered the greatest historian of antiquity, and he wrote a wonderful history of the Romans. But he talked about writing history, and I do have it in here. It's quite an interesting statement when you consider it was made such a long time ago.
Dr. Adams, to reiterate, did you say yesterday that regardless of whether the North had won or the South had won, slavery was on its way out and it would have disappeared anyway, just a matter of timing? Well,
yeah, let me on that issue, the European writers, there was a very substantial number of European writers that favored the Confederacy. I guess maybe you know that. They really wanted the South to secede. But at the same time, they were very much anti-slave. And so it looked like they had a dilemma here. If you favor the Confederacy and the Confederacy will perpetuate slavery, and of course they even talked about reopening the slave trade and extending it all the way down to Cape Horn. But the argument was this, that right now slavery is on its way out throughout the world. All of the nations are getting rid of it and have gotten rid of it. The Netherlands did. Of course, the British did a long time ago. The French did. Even the Danes had it. They got rid of it. The Russians freed 30 million serfs. It was just a general feeling that slavery had no place in Western civilization and that it had to go. But as long as it was in the Union and long as it was protected by the Constitution, if it had the power of the Union and the Union was a very powerful force throughout the world, it would stay. In other words, slavery was protected in the Union and we probably wouldn't get rid of it. But if the South seceded and they were on their own, then the world would gang up on them and force them to abolish slavery. And there was an economic sanctions, pressure on them, maybe intellectual pressure, but that's the way they could support the Confederacy and secession and at the same time live with slavery, which the world really hated at that time. So that's the way the argument went. And so you frequently read in the writings, in the European writings, that with secession, slavery would be ended sooner than if the South stayed in if the North, the South stayed in. Well, Lincoln was well aware that he was talking about keeping it around for a long, long time. If it had been abolished, but in his early days, he didn't think he could interfere with it, and that maybe it would last for quite a while. On the slave issue, one of the dumbest things the Southerners ever did was to make it a major point for secession. Now, Calhoun said that the reason that it became an issue is because he couldn't get enough interest in the tariff for secession and for the Southern states to want to move out on their own, so he resorted to slavery. So then you read these various ordinances of secession, which you probably might be familiar with, and they do talk about slavery. Slavery's endangered, and we're going to secede from the Union. But it wasn't endangered. That was the thing that was such a strange thing, is that Lincoln made it clear. As one British writer said, that Lincoln was prepared to give slavery more protection than it had ever before enjoyed. So how can you say it was slavery? But they do say it because these idiots, excuse my expression, these leaders of the South behind the secession ordinance made it such a big point. It was too bad, because I think if they had not done that, I think they would have had European strong support, recognition, which is what they wanted most of all. They wanted recognition from Europe, and I think they would have got the support, because Europeans looked upon the United States as a dangerous country. They used some pretty harsh language. We were a dangerous bunch over here, and better off to break us up, and so we wouldn't have so much potential power. After all, we stole half of Mexico, and the Mexicans are getting it back now. One of the recent leaders in Texas of the Mexican group, he says we're gonna take over this place because we're having the babies. And there's some truth in that, believe it or not. My son married a Mexican girl, and she's one of 11 children, and her mother was one of 14. So, you add those up, and they'll figure each one there has a dozen kids. So pretty soon they're going to take over, and they have taken over. The population of the Latins is a large percentage of the nation, so maybe they will take over. Okay, I'm going to try to get up here a little bit into the...
I interrupted you.
Yeah, go ahead.
A quote. You're looking for a quote when I interrupted you on something.
Which one? Oh,
In your book?
You were looking for a quote in that book when I interrupted you.
you did. You shouldn't have done that. Well, one of the interesting quotes that I kind of like is Lincoln on on free trade or on tariff. Let's see if I got the right. I got the damn many books here. I should have only written one. You'd be surprised. I said, what book is that in? But here's what Lincoln said this on low tariffs. He said, must result in the increase in both useless labor and idleness, and so in proportion must produce want and ruin among our people. He's talking about a tariff, a low tariff. Isn't that nutty? That's what he said. Well, let me see what else I could have been looking up. I looked at Madison. I told you that. I told you about Hamilton when he said, well, the reason we will prevent the majority from overtaxing the minority is because we have a clause in the Constitution that says taxes have to be uniform. And that's a nice idea, but it hasn't worked. And that particular problem goes back to the Constitutional Convention when they had debates, and you can read them. And when they submitted the Constitution to the Committee on Style, they had the term uniform and equal. And for some strange reason, the Committee on Style at the Constitutional Convention deleted uniform and equal. And as far as we know, Madison wrote in uniform in his own handwriting on the draft, and that's where it came from. But they were pretty clear that it had to be the same for everybody. That's not why it was there.
That would only apply to, on a federal level,
Yeah.
to allow the states to do it.
Yeah. Although generally, as Thomas Cooley, one of the great scholars, said that a tax that is not uniform and equal is not a tax. It's a form of confiscation. It's a form of stealing if it's not uniform. Because the person who is treated unequally is being treated unfairly, and you're taxing without his consent. These are sort of the arguments that go along. Well, I wish I could know what I was good looking for.
It was the Polybius quote on writing history.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It was the quote on Polybius. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, Polybius wrote, this is in my preface, he said, a good person, even a political person, ought to love his friends, his country, his party, and should share their loyalties and hatreds. But a person who takes up the role of historian must discard all considerations of this kind. The historian may have to speak well of his or her enemies, and even award them the highest praise should their actions demand this. For just as a living creature is deprived of its eyesight, if deprived of its eyesight, is rendered completely helpless, so if history is deprived of the truth, we are left with nothing but an idle, unprofitable tale. That was Polybius wrote that, and I'm glad you asked me to look it up. I got sidetracked on it because, and I was talking about the fact that people just don't seem to be able to be honest about history, particularly if they're partisans. If they're, we have a magazine called The Southern Partisan, and I've written for them, but the magazine says they're partisan. So so you're not surprised that they have a strong view on the Southern cause and on the history of Civil War, because that's their name. They're not holding themselves out as being really an objective magazine. They have a rough time of it, incidentally. It's kind of interesting. I've known the editor and the publisher for many years, but oh well. Macmillan Magazine in Britain wrote a question and sent one of their correspondents over to America to answer the question, what on earth is the North fighting for? What on earth they're fighting for? What's the war about? The British had a lot of trouble trying to figure this out. And he went over to America and he got these answers, and he wrote back. He said, well, we are not fighting for emancipation. We are not fighting for the blacks. We are fighting for the whites, for plain economic interests. Well, that kind of said it all. So then he writes back to his editors and he says, hey, this is what they're fighting for. Even the North Americans saw this, some of the better one, the North American Review, which was published out of Boston, and said, well, the South seceded on the pretext of slavery. But the mask has been thrown off, and we know now that what they want is economic independence, and they want to see New York, Boston, and Philadelphia shorn of their economic power, and they see the economics shift to Charleston and New Orleans and Savannah, and that this would become the great trading centers of the world. So there was really a bitter contest here between economic interests, and that was really what was the cause of the war. One British firm wrote, and simply one British writer said that this is simply a contest for empire or independence. The South wants independence, and the Northerners want to retain their empire. And one of the fellows who caught on to that was General Scott, Winfield Scott, and he talked to this writer, and he said, isn't the British Empire worth fighting for? He asked the question, meaning, of course, that the American Empire was worth fighting for. So we have great economic struggles for our story of our Civil War, and I think we have to kind of come to the idea that that's what it was really all about. The slave issue got mixed up in it, and I think it was the worst thing that happened to the South to get it mixed up in it. They should have focused on the right of secession, and the funny thing is, there's a new book came out, a new British writer that came out. This is a rather recent book, and he said what most Americans don't want to realize is that Lincoln did not believe in the self-determination of peoples. You know, that's in the United Nations Charter, and it was in the Atlantic Charter that Franklin Roosevelt signed, a self-determination of peoples. They said that when you get down to it, he didn't believe in that. And Americans should have to acknowledge and admit that, because now that's become an important factor in the world. We want the self-determination of peoples. We also had an interesting thing when the Chinese premier was here a couple of years ago, and they were kind of concerned about Taiwan and starting a war over Taiwan, and he said, well, look at Lincoln. He says, we can go to war over Taiwan because Lincoln is our authority to do so. And so that there's not much you can say. Even Gorbachev said that when the Soviet Union was breaking up. He said the same thing. Again, Lincoln went to war to preserve his union. Why can't I go to war to preserve the Soviet Union? So it has become a bit of a thorn in our side that's what he had. Well, secession has historically been a dangerous thing. And I have a chapter in my book called The Dangerous Road to Secession. And in it we can go back to the ancient Greeks and to the city-states that tried to withdraw from the Athenian League, and we found out that they got crushed. The Romans had the same problem, and it was always over taxes. The Boudica story was a tax revolt, and she wanted to get out from under the taxes. She wanted to secede from the Roman Empire. And we come up into the modern world, the poor Scots. The Scots tried for 500 years to secede from the English. And they finally were put down just before American independence in one of the final revolts, and that was sort of the end of it. But what I liked about that revolt that was so interesting is that the British went in, and with the same fury and violence that Sherman did in going into the South, they went up into Scotland, and they literally obliterated the Scots, and the Scots never again came back. But one of the things that they did, and I think maybe nobody ever noticed this, we have the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the right to bear arms, and they took away from the Scots the right to bear arms. because for 400 or 500 years they'd been bearing arms and battling the damn English, and they hated them with a passion and wanted to get out of there. So they took away the right of the Scots to bear arms. And this was in around 1760. It was only about 15 years before the American Revolutionary period. And I think that the Second Amendment in the American Constitution has its roots in what the British did to the Scots by taking away their right to bear arms. And now we argue about what it means, but I think it really meant that just like the Americans didn't want to be in the problem that the Scots got themselves into. They wanted to be able to bear arms. And so this was only 15 years. That's not very far. When you get my age, 15 years is like yesterday. Your age might look like it's long. But so they took away the right of the Scots to bear arms. There was also the Poles. They had, revolt after revolt. In fact, one of the, I think it's rather cute little illustrations in this book on Civil War that I wrote. It shows Abraham Lincoln and the Tsar of Russia. And this was at the time that the Poles had risen up for the fourth time in the last 20 years, and almost for the last time, and then the Russians really crushed them. And he said, "Imperial son of Nicholas the Great," and this is Abraham Lincoln, "Imperial son of Nicholas the Great, we err in the same fix, I calculate. You with the Poles, with southern rebels I, who spurn my rule and my revenge defy." Alexander, or the Tsar says, "Vengeance is mine, old man." He called Lincoln old man. "Vengeance is mine, old man, see where it falls. Behold yon harsh laid waste and ruined walls. You gibbets where the struggling patriot hangs, while my brave myrmidons enjoy his pangs." But I thought that's a delightful that came from, it came from Punch magazine. Yeah, Punch magazine. But so here we have the Poles, they're struggling. So attempts to secede have always been pretty tough, and I think that the Southerners, they obviously bit off more than they can chew. In fact, I thought the two most interesting thing about the Civil War period was the Southerners' belief that they could succeed with secession. They just didn't have a prayer. And many of the foreign writers saw that. They said, "My God, they don't have any armament. Hell, they don't have enough industry to make a teapot." No, literally. How in the world, in a modern war, can they create the armaments necessary, to go to war against this major power, which was in the North, the United States, which had everything. They had the foundries, they had the manufacturing, the ships, everything. It was just hopelessly outnumbered. And that pretty well made it pretty obvious. The other side of the Civil War is the Northern belief that they could destroy Southern culture. And they really talked about it. They were going to go in there and they were going to do this and do that, and they were going to take over the South, and they sent in their armies and they had the generals run stuff. And that went along pretty good until there was a presidential election that ended up kind of in doubt, with Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden. Maybe Tilden kind of won. Well, the Republicans, the Southerners got in touch with the Republicans and says, "Okay, well, vote in the presidential what that powwow where they get
Electoral College."
Yeah, the Electoral College. We'll vote in the Electoral College for your man Rutherford if you will pack up your armies and leave, which they did. And when they left, of course, the blacks who had thought they were going to be top dogs down there, and even said so, suddenly realized they were on the outs, and the Southern whites came back and really took over things, and that was kind of sad because if the blacks were sure misled, and even today you have the bitterness down here and the problem down here because the whites came back and they set up strong segregation and all the various problems that we've had. So Well, anyway, so much for the Scots and the Poles. Pardon?
I don't understand that the U.S. Constitution provides a means for an independent state to join the Union or to break away from that, right? So why didn't we go through the legitimate steps to secede from the Union instead of fighting?
Well, it was, those people were called the blundering generation. You know, and I think another thing that at this particular time in world history, war and imperialism was a real big thing. And America wanted to get in the imperialistic mode, just like Britain and France and Germany and Italy. So they were so gung-ho to go to war, like when Lincoln called for 75. See, after the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 men, and he allocated to each of the states how many regiments they were to give. And of course, the border states said, "Go stick it." You know, they weren't going to do it at all. I mean, Arkansas and those states said, "We're not sending any men. You're going to use that to invade our countrymen." But in the North, boy, they just were so oversubscribed, and there were, you know, you see pictures or etchings of the troops going down Fifth Avenue, New York, and Broadway, and boy, they're just going to go get those guys. You know, it was a pretty ugly time, and in that sense, the North wanted war, and they wanted to crush the South, and they wanted to destroy them. Even some of the abolitionists who were dangerous. You talk about terrorists. Today you read what the abolitionists in the North wanted to do. They wanted to exterminate the South, kill every man, woman, and child, lay all the cities to ashes, and then repopulate the place. Now, boy, if that's not terrorism, nothing is. And these were ministers in the North. These were the Northern Abolitionist Society, and that's why the British Abolitionist Society wanted no part of them. Thought they were some lunatics.
And they based their legitimacy on the emancipation of the black.
Pardon?
They based their legitimacy of that war on the emancipation of the black as a pretext.
Yeah, as a pretext. Yeah. In fact, the main thing Lincoln wanted to do, along with the abolitionists, they kind of went together. They wanted to gather all the blacks together and persuade as many free blacks as they could to go back to Africa where they came from. And that was a pretty crackpot idea because there's only 3.5 million of them. I mean, even today we couldn't have done that. So that's a sad time in history. One of the things that also, I guess that one of the things about this period was the total destruction of civil rights and civil liberties throughout the Union. The Columbia Law Review said there was 38,000 people were locked up and imprisoned by Lincoln. The newspapers were shut down, and not only were they were shut down, their editors had disappeared too, and this turned out to be a problem to shut down the newspapers. And so apparently the War Department in the North got the idea, well, we don't need to shut down the newspapers. It makes people unhappy. We'll just arrest the editor and throw him in jail, and then the newspaper can still keep coming. Boy, it was just a bad time in terms of that. The one thing I focused on in some of my research, which was of interest, I thought, was the story involving Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. And Roger B. Taney was the Chief Justice of the United States. And there was a guy named Merriman who was thought to be a bit of a rebel down there in Maryland. And so they arrested him and threw him into the federal fort down there in the harbor in Maryland. And he was able to get his lawyer to file a petition for habeas corpus to challenging the right to incarcerate him. Now, you people know what habeas corpus is. It's one of the most basic rights And that's the thing that Guantanamo Bay is about, a problem. Here you got all these guys locked up, and they have no right to see a lawyer, no right to habeas corpus, and yet it's one of the most fundamental principles of liberty, because you go to other countries where you don't have this, and they lock people up and throw the key away. But in America, under the Constitution, you can't do that. And the way the Constitution reads is that Congress has the right to suspend the right of habeas corpus. It's in the powers of Congress, but Lincoln went ahead and did it on his own. He didn't even do that, and they went and arrested this guy named Merriman and threw him in the can, and his lawyer gets out a writ of habeas corpus, takes the writ into the Chief Justice of the United States, who signs the order ordering the general to bring in, and this is the way it works, you order to bring in the body, habeas corpus, bring in the person and justify why you can hold him against his will. That's what habeas corpus is. Probably the most important liberty that you folks enjoy. Well, what happened is that he went out to serve the writ, and they wouldn't let him in. And there was an order for a hearing, and of course the general sends one of his aide-de-camps to come, and he's got his sash and he's got his big sword, and he goes wandering into the courtroom, and he says, President Lincoln says, I don't have to do this. He's our man, and we're going to hold him. Goodbye. The Chief Justice then wrote out the opinion, ex parte Merriman, in which he explained that you can't do that, President. You have to bring this man in, and you must bring this man in. And so, at that particular stage, he sent the federal marshal down again to serve the writ, and once again he was barred entrance by the soldiers that would let him in. At this stage, what Taney should have done, what do you do? Let's suppose that instead of it was this case, suppose it was me. And suppose they had barred, the federal marshal came to get me and haul me before the court so they could show just cause for holding me. What would the judge do? His remedy is to swear out a posse. How many men it takes, it doesn't matter, to come in and seize me or take me and the guy who's holding me and haul him in the court and fine him for contempt for not bringing it in. So Taney's remedy would have been to have brought in a posse. Maybe take 1,000 men, brought a posse. Instead of that, he writes out this opinion telling the President of the United States that he can't do this. And it's a beautiful opinion. I consider it one of the great opinions of the Supreme Court. It was totally ignored, and Taney then said that he was afraid that before nightfall he'd be arrested for doing this. And he almost was. And while it doesn't show up in any of the government stuff or in any Lincoln's ref, in the private papers of the federal marshal, he tells a story that Lincoln signed a warrant to arrest the Chief Justice of the United States, gave it to him, and said, use your own discretion unless you hear otherwise. Now that disappeared from history. And it turned out that the Lincolnites, I like to call the Lincoln lovers, said, well, it's a phony deal. It never happened. Lincoln would never have done anything like that. Arrest the Chief Justice of the United States? You got to be kidding. Well, the federal marshal wrote it out in his private papers that this is what happened. And then in the research that I was fortunate enough to do, I found confirmation of it in two sources. One by Justice Benjamin R. Curtis, and Benjamin R. Curtis was a remarkable man. He was a justice of the Supreme Court. He wrote the dissenting opinion in Dred Scott, which Lincoln carried around in his pocket when he was having the debates with Senator Douglas, debate with Stephen Douglas. And he got in such a ruckus with the Chief Justice over the Dred Scott case that he resigned. And so he somewhat disappears from history, except he was probably the most important lawyer in America at the time. He represented the President of the United States in the trial of impeachment for the Senate, Johnson. And should have been Lyndon Johnson, but it wasn't. It was another Johnson. and he wrote a little pamphlet called Executive Power, in which he attacked the Republican administration for what they were doing, not only in the tax and in the taking away civil liberties and rights and stuff like that. And he didn't publish it. He gave it. He sent it around to some of his friends, and they said, "You got to publish that. You got to publish that." And he says, "Yeah, publish that, and then what's going to happen to me?" And so he published it, and he told his wife, he said, "Well, if I don't come home at night, you can go down to the federal fort, and that's where I will be." But he was so important that they didn't touch him. I think if it had been anybody else, he'd have been in the slammer for sure. But it's a wonderful pamphlet if you guys can ever dig it up. It's called Executive Power, and it's by Benjamin R. Curtis. And he really came. Now he believed in the cause of the North. He wasn't a Southerner. He believed in the cause of the North, but he didn't believe in the abuse of power that the executive branch of government was doing. And he even challenged the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't think Lincoln had the right to do that. He didn't think that was within his presidential powers to take away property, because slavery was property and you can't take away without just compensation. And so, well, what are you guys doing this for? But they didn't pick him up in the middle of the night like he thought he was. But his pamphlet on executive power, I think, became the basis for the case of Ex parte Milligan. Ex parte Milligan was decided in 1866. But what happened? Milligan was up in Ohio, and he was a kind of a pro-Confederate. So they tried to indict him in a civil case, in a civil court, for treason and disloyalty, and the grand jury wouldn't do it. So they then went to the military court, and that was no problem, so they hauled him in the military court and charged him and convicted him and sentenced him to be hanged. Nice, quick, swift justice in Milligan. But at that time, the Supreme Court jumped in 1866 and wrote an opinion saying you can't do that. And probably it's the basis for what we're doing now in Guantanamo was the Milligan case, probably the judicial basis for it. It was the wonderful decision, and they said that as long as civilian courts are open, you cannot use military courts. Now, what that meant in the times is that the trial and execution of the so-called conspirators of Lincoln was illegal. And what was the name of the lady? Who was it? Surratt. Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt was tried, convicted, and hung. And when they were hauling her out to hang her, the other men who were the conspirators said, "She's innocent. She had nothing to do with it." Her only problem was she had a boarding house where John Booth Luke's, but Booth was, and so therefore guilt by association, and therefore, but she was tried by a military court after the war when the civilian courts were open. She should have been indicted by a grand jury and tried with a jury of people, like she should have been. But they just railroaded her through, and then they hung her. And of course, her lawyer at the time said, well, they would have hung her on any evidence. They were just determined to hang somebody for the assassination of Lincoln. But it's a marvelous example of the importance of being tried by civilian courts, be indicted by a grand jury, because here's what happens when military courts handle these things. And I think what they're going to do out in Guantanamo, they're going to maybe try these guys by a military court. I don't know. It's going to be worth watching, because you have these fundamental principles of liberty in the Constitution that are being tossed out the window. Now, I wrote an article. It was a bit of a joke to one of the guys who's yelling that, for these guys to have their civil liberties. And I said, well, as far as the terrorists go, if they're terrorists, I said, it's very simple, give them a fair trial and then hang them. I said, what's the problem? He didn't answer me. Oh, well. That's one of the fun things about being a writer. I was originally planning on being a teacher at the college and university level, and one of the things that I was told by somebody who talked me out of it is that when you're in a university, you kind of have to toe the party line. You know, the dean and the president of the school, he says, you can't really write what you really want to write. And based on that and a few other things, I thought that maybe that was a good idea. And this particular advisor of mine, a man in the family that we knew, and a lawyer, he said, well, why don't you make it a hobby, your writing? And then you can say anything you want to say. And, of course, I have all these books, and I've said anything I want to say. In fact, one guy I used to work for died, and he got in a lot of trouble with the service, and his wife wrote me, and she said, you sure have a lot of courage. She was talking about my tax books. And I've never been too much afraid of the IRS, but I do know that they can be pretty difficult at times. That's kind of an understatement. Just in some of the personal experiences I've had, that one of them that was kind of interesting, you talk about income tax. I had a client who owed the IRS some money, and he was being, the collection division was trying to run him down, and for some reason they thought I must have had some of his money hidden away, which I hadn't. In fact, as a matter of fact, he owed me money, if you want to get down to him. He was weird, didn't pay his bills. So I get this call from this IRS agent and saying that they want to talk to me about one of my clients. And I said, well, I don't talk about my clients. Lawyers don't do that. Well, we won't talk about our clients. They said, you be in your office tomorrow morning at 8:30. I normally didn't get in until 9, so at 8:30 I'm there, and doesn't show up. No call comes in. And so I tell my secretary I had things to do. I said, if that Treasury agent calls, you tell them I don't talk to them about my client's affairs anyway. So apparently she told him that, and he said, well, Mr. Adams wants to play rough. So they went out and they seized my client's trust account at the bank. And the bank calls me and said, they seized my trust account. Well, I was livid, understatement of the word. And so I knew the fellow who signed the order to seize the trust account, and I'd known he would be the supervisor at that particular office, and so I called him up and I used language I wouldn't even use here. It was just all men's. Next thing I knew, they released it. They released the account, and apparently he told the agent, he says, you might get a little trouble with this guy. Well, I was still livid. No, the rest of the story is I wrote to a congressman who happened to be our former law partner, and I told him about it, and he wrote me back, and he said, well, I tried to talk to the district director, his name was Schmidt down in Los Angeles, and he says, that's all I can do. And I said, well, they had no business doing this. So then, not letting go, because when you get them, you don't want to let them go. I had them by the so because they were wrong. I mean, they were so wrong. So I then packed up all my information, sent it to the Board of Governors of the California State Bar, and I says, this is what's happened. Well, they then ordered or asked the director of the IRS to come in and explain things, and they're in San Francisco, and he was in L.A., so he went up there and with his hat in his hand, and he said, well, we're sorry, and we won't do it anymore. And because apparently they'd done it to others. I wasn't the only one. And so fine. So then I get a letter from the State Bar telling me what had happened, and there wasn't, they weren't going to do it anymore. Well, the story's not over. About 3 weeks later, I get a call from the IRS. They're going to audit me. Me personally, yeah. I'm going to be personally audited. Have all my records ready and find a CPA and be there on such and such a day. Never showed up. A year later, they call me. They're going to audit me. Okay, fine. Everything's ready. They never showed up. Finally, it got to the point where the statute of limitations was going to run on me. So I know what they're going to do. I guess it's a tax story. Yeah, okay. So anyway, they then said they're going to issue a jeopardy assessment, seize everything I had. And I says, do it. Then I never heard from them again. At the end of them. But you see, they were so mad because the district director had to go eat crow. And then now they're going to get that upstart lawyer up there. That's one of the great experiences of my life. I got a lot of interesting stories that came in my practice, but I think that was one of the most interesting. It shows you that they were wrong, and I could have done nothing once they released the levy, which they did after I called up the supervisor and raised hell. But I felt that they had gone too far, and I said, don't let them get off the hook. And so I pursued it. I remember the letter I got from the congressman, who was a former partner, and he said, Charles, I did everything I could. He says, but you know, these people, we can't, even we in the Congress can't move them because they're sort of beyond this. It's like Representative Hansen, who was a representative from Idaho, and he wrote a book called To Harass Our People, and he talked about all the troubles that yes.
I'm sorry to take you back to the beginning of the story here at
the
end, but exactly who was the trustee and who was the beneficiary of this trust account?
Oh, a lawyer by law has to have a trust account for his client's money, period. So it is not normal trust concept of a trustee and a trustor and all that. But the law says you cannot commingle your client's monies with your monies. And lawyers do it and get in trouble all the time. So their assumption was that I had this client's money in my trust account, hiding it. You see, as I told you, he owed me money. Hell, everything is.
By shutting down your whole practice, really, if you couldn't transact your client's
well, one of the problems was I had money in there for the IRS for other clients. And the taxes they were supposed to pay, and they paid me, and then I would pay the service. So it was a pretty bold and aggressive move, and they had nothing to go on other than I just told them I wouldn't talk to them because lawyers don't talk about their clients' affairs, and it's important that you do that. You don't talk to them, period. That's the rules.
What year was that approximately?
That would have been. You want to know how old I am?
Well, I mean, what was it? Was it in the 90s?
No.
But in the 90s, wasn't it?
This was in the 60s. This was about 65, 67, around in there.
Okay.
I just a young attorney, yeah.
Well, your experience along with others built up to where they finally said they put some clamps on the IRS.
Well, what they did, I didn't tell you. They not only did I complain to the state bar, I complained to the American Bar Association. Now, we're really going to get these guys, you see. And the American Bar Association put me on a committee to draft legislation to prevent the IRS from doing this. So we did. We drafted legislation, and it died in the committee. You know what happened? The service showed up and said, we'll be good. But I'm glad I could tell that story because it's something that people should know about, and it had a good ending. It had a lot of fun. From my standpoint, I could have dropped it, like I said at the beginning, but I felt I had these guys by the yin-yang, and I wasn't going to let them off. And it's too bad they do get away with abuses like that. I mean, I remember the lady, the collecting officer was Mrs. Tripp. That I remember her name. Yeah, and she was an ornery old buzzard. But I think she might have been a little embarrassed after that. I think it's very often within the service, the district director would have said, "Who in the hell was the idiot that did this?" Which was pretty. But this is the problem that we discussed when I asked the question this morning when I first started off, and I said that liberty has the seeds of slavery in it, and the seeds are that you grant extraordinary taxes, and then the government has to have extraordinary powers to collect the tax, and then liberty is lost. And this is exactly what it is. These guys have these awesome powers. I think one of the sad things of recent that I've noticed is that I used to notice at 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace. I used to frequently tell stories about IRS abuses. He hadn't done it for years. Yeah, I watched pretty faithfully. I don't think there's been an IRS abuse on that program for years. Go ahead.
John Stossel would. If one came up.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, but 60 Minutes is such an important thing. And see, what usually happens is that they audit these guys, and then pretty soon they say, well, you lay off of us, we'll lay off of you. And one of the earliest examples of IRS misdeeds was a Reader's Digest ran a series called The Tyranny of the IRS. And this is many, many years ago, and they had some pretty ugly stories in there. So the United States Congress, the Ways and Means Committee, decided to hold hearings on it because what had happened. Did you know that the only person before the hearing was the Commissioner of Internal Revenue? He didn't bring in any of the people and any of the stories, and the idea was, well, the Commissioner said it's no big deal, and so we drop it. So I guess what Hansen did, Hansen, who wrote this book, and he got in all kinds of trouble, he went to the Ways and Means Committee and says, you ought to investigate some of these things the IRS is doing. And his answer was, the committee said that they were scared to death of what the IRS might do to them. No, they're scared to death. And not if your own Congress is scared to death, you've now got a fourth branch of government. In a sense, the tax people.
Well, Archer wouldn't have said that, would he?
Who?
Bill Archer? He wouldn't have kept that.
I don't know when Hansen probably did that when the Democrat guy was in, the guy they got in the slammer. Remember the Ways and Means?
Dan Chicago.
Dan Rostenkowski.
The guy, Rokowski, yeah. It had to be then. It had to be then because the Republicans weren't in. But at least that's in Hansen's book. They're afraid of the death of what the IRS might do to them, so they didn't want to. And recently they did have some hearings in the Senate. About 4 or 5 years ago. You remember those? And they had the guys with hoods and the unidentified and not a good job. That's not the way it should be. What we did in Canada, just to show, because our IRS, our revenue was worse, was terrible, really misbehaving. So the House of Commons committees organized into twos, and they went into all the major cities of Canada with an ad in the newspaper to come in and tell us about your problems with our Revenue Department, of Revenue Canada. And, of course, Revenue Canada was mad as hell, and they said we're getting a hose job, but that did a good thing. The problem with the Senate is that they just stayed in Washington and invited a few people in and put on a little dog and pony show. What they should have done, they should have gone from city to city just like the Canadians. Yeah, and go from city to city and let the people come in and tell their stories. And maybe if there's enough members of the Congress, they go out by twos and they maybe could go to 50 cities. I thought the Canadians did that right because they behaved themselves since then. So it would be nice. Anyway, I was thinking of some of the interesting European stories that are in. What was the famous tennis player that was so good? What was her name? The German girl? You remember her?
Not Navratilova.
No. A German. Yeah. She had her father do some tax planning for her. You remember? Well, he went to jail. The thing that was so dumb about her, being a German, she could have given up her German residency, just residency, moved to Monaco, where a lot of the great athletes go, and then she wouldn't have any tax problems. So simple. she could go back to Germany as a visitor, you know, and there wouldn't have been a problem. And then she could keep all the jacks, all the money she was making, you know, sometimes.
And she can keep her passport?
Oh, yeah, just change residency. The thing the Americans don't understand, don't appreciate, is that America taxes citizenship. The rest of the world taxes residency. And that makes a lot of difference. That means if you get fed up with the tax system, you just move to another country. Now, you might have a departure tax and a few things like that, but there's no problem with your citizenship because they only tax residents. And if you're not a resident, there's no tax. So being a German, all she had to do was go to a tax haven, and Monaco was full of a lot of famous athletes that go there. I mean, what was a skier? Stingman, the great Swedish skier, Ingmar Stingman or something, many years ago. He lives there. Stingman, I think. Stingman. He was Olympic champion many years ago. But he's just an example of one of many great European athletes who made a lot of money and lives in Monaco.
So you could claim a residency of some place, but you don't lose your citizenship.
No, not in the slightest. Because it's a tax on you're a resident of the country, and you have to contribute to pay the services that the country provided. And if you're not there, there's nothing to provide. Just like this, I live in Canada, and Canada provides all kinds of stuff, a lot more than America does. It's somewhat socialistic, you know. We got wonderful medical care, and nobody goes there. We never use it unless we're dying and we can't get out of the country, you know. I don't want to knock them too much. But it's the price you pay for socialized medicine. You just don't get the services that you'd like to have. Well, let me see what we're doing up there. Going over my notes here slowly.
What were the war taxes that were passed during the Civil War?
The war tax?
There were some taxes passed that were later declared unconstitutional.
Well, there was the income tax.
Any others?
No, that's all I recall. Yeah, they passed an income tax, and of course it might get you a little prelude to tomorrow. But I did talk a little bit about the second whiskey rebellion, which was the attempt to tax whiskey in the South. And so when the federal armies left, we mentioned that, and I guess it was 1876 or so, the only thing that survived was the IR, not S, but B. And this was the origin of the Internal Revenue Bureau, yes?
I know it's not a tax, but certainly the printing of paper money with no passing of silver or gold that occurred during the war, I would consider that a tax. The greenback, they started printing money.
Yeah, well, that was Chase's, your old friend Chase.
Chase's number.
If you look at the $1 greenback, I got one, as a matter of fact. In fact, I think I put it in my book. There he is. But the greenback, the Congress passed the first what you call greenback law, and the courts held it unconstitutional because the Constitution says you can coin money. It didn't say you could print the damn stuff. So then they came back, and eventually the Supreme Court said it's okay. But actually, it had trouble in the courts because it violated the Constitution, and so that's true. I was just going to give you one neat little story about during the whiskey days in the South, with the origin and the beginning of the Internal Revenue Bureau. They paid rewards for informers, wonderful practice. And the most interesting story of that period was the Martins and the Coys, the Feud Mountain Boys. You remember who they were? Hatfields and McCoys, yeah. I said, what that was about is one of the McCoys or the Hatfields snitched on the other because they were all making illegal booze and got the reward. And then the other guys knew about it, and that was the basis of that horrible family feud where they were shooting and killing each other for generations. it was because one of them snitched on the other one that they were making booze and got their butt. And another thing they would do to make it frustrating is that they gave $10 to anybody who would come in and testify and so forth. So if they arrested the old man, for making, booze, little liquor, then the whole family would show up to testify against him. They all get $10. Then he would get fined $100, and then he'd claim poverty, so they dropped the fine. So it was a little way of making a little money on the side using the system. Oh well, there are a lot of interesting things that came out of that period. I'm just trying to think of isn't it George Jones that has a Western ballad about white lightning? You remember that? Yeah, White Lightning. Yeah, that's what it's called. It's called White Lightning, and it's a cute little ballad because you get the impression it has a lot of punch to it. You ever had it?
Yeah.
Is it strong?
It's 180 proof.
Ooh, wow. Now I know why they call it White Lightning. My day's been made. Now I learned something.
It's in a mason jar and it's just as clear as water. Clear as water.
I see.
Everclear, what you call Everclear?
Yeah, isn't that something? 180 proof. Man, that has really got a punch. I mean, the 100 proof vodka is about as strong as you can buy, isn't it, normally? Yeah.
You can buy Kentucky whiskey. It's 110 proof.
Uh-huh. You mean in a liquor store?
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, most of those stock is in special order.
Well, anyway, so that's one of the stories on the whiskey tax and the Internal Revenue Bureau. Yeah, IRB. Actually, it was called the Internal Revenue Bureau up until my lifetime. I think service. They all of a sudden got in the service idea. Yeah.
Before we get off the tax of the war, I think the cruelest tax that was ever imposed on the South was the 7 cents tax of a pound on cotton.
Yeah, I remember that.
Started in 1868, after the Reconstruction. You talk about a cruel tax. I mean, when the South literally had nothing.
Yeah,
to tax cotton, which it only could have been grown in 7 states. I just can't believe anybody could be that cruel.
Well, they were.
I don't know what to say.
I think they stole most of the cotton too that they tried to tax, didn't they? Yeah, I do remember that particular story.
Yeah, they seized because they couldn't pay.
They couldn't pay it, so they stole it. Yeah. Well, I think that's about it. Unless you got something else, we got a few more minutes. I'd like to discuss some more interesting stories of mine. Yeah. I like that story, the service. Yeah. I remember a man I worked for, his name was Harry Margolis, and he was a very aggressive tax planner. And I remember some of his antics where service would show up to audit one of his friends, and he'd go out there and he'd walk in and he'd say, "Get out! Get out!" And of course the IRS agents were just shocked, and because he'd run them off the place. The thing about him that was so interesting is they really want to get him. I mean, they really want to get him. And I understand they had as many as 50 agents working on his work. They never could nail him. He was acquitted on 2 big trials, and one of them did in San Francisco, but they wanted so much to nail him that they hired some of the professors from New York University, NYU, and they shipped them out there, and they were there for 4 months, because they wanted the best in the business, to get this guy. He was acquitted on all counts. And they went home just talking to themselves. And since I had worked for him, they came to me, and I didn't work for them then, and they wanted to know if I would assist them in their prosecution of Margolis. And I said, no. I says, the problem is he's going to win. Because I knew how he operated. I understood the theory and the practice, and I felt that he was within the law. And I said, he's going to win. Oh, no, we got him. We got these big guys. We got these big guns from the East. I says, you watch. And sure enough, I acquitted him on all counts.
Who is this? Who is this?
Margolis was his name, Kerry Margolis. He was in San Francisco. He represented a lot of big people. He represented Inger Stevens, who was an actress. Many of the Hollywood crowd he represented. He had some ingenious techniques which were really brilliant.
I noticed just this week on the news that they have indicted the former president of Chile and have seized his American bank accounts on tax evasion.
Oh, yeah? How would he evade U.S. taxes being the president of Chile?
Pinochet.
Huh?
Pinochet.
Oh, that guy. You mean that? Yeah. Well, isn't he in pretty bad health?
Yeah.
Yeah, that figures
They're
it.
going after his money. They don't care.
Oh, yeah.
They
Well,
didn't get him, so they wanted to get his
the sequence, the Margolis story was that he got brain cancer about 15 years ago. And they indicted him with brain cancer. I thought that was pretty ridiculous. They proceeded to try, and he beat him again. 14 counts, none guilty. He was a tenacious little Jewish guy that was a genius, and he was a little bit wacky, in some ways, because I saw that one of the reasons I disassociated with him is because I thought he was nuts in some of the stuff that he did. I had one case where he had some he was always doing things that he used to say that everybody thinks I'm a crackpot. That was his own expression. And he was a crackpot. Not about. But in this particular case, the service came in and they audited this family, and they came up with what you call a revenue agent's report. It was 870. It was simply you sign here and then pay the bill. It was simply the agent's report. So they came up in this case with a charge of, I think, $5,000, and I said, pay it. Close the file. No, Margolis says, no, I'm not going to pay it, blah, blah, blah. So he didn't pay it, and it didn't turn out right. But he was arrogant. He felt he could beat anybody. He died, unfortunately, but I wish somebody would write up a history of his life, because he was a very interesting guy. Well, see you tomorrow. We'll talk about, we'll take the income tax from the beginning to the end. We'll take it apart. And you can all become and get jobs working for H.W. Block. Is it H.W. Block? I don't remember. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll tell you, one of the most interesting stories I'll tell you tomorrow is Howard Hughes. You will find this fascinating.